For weeks, the reporters covering the disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie had operated in a state of suspended animation. They had asked questions that bounced off legal representatives. They had scrutinized empty driveways and analyzed the statements of grieving family members. But the son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, had offered them nothing. He had been a void in the center of the story, a man wrapped in the protective insulation of attorneys and strategic absence. So when he finally stepped up to the podium, the physical posture of the room changed. Journalists leaned forward over their notebooks. The ambient whispering ceased entirely. The clicking of camera shutters accelerated into a continuous mechanical hum. Everyone in that space understood that the architecture of the investigation was about to be fundamentally altered. Tommaso adjusted the microphone, a small, unnecessary movement that betrayed a meticulous need for control. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, his expression unreadable, devoid of the raw, unpolished anguish that the public had grown accustomed to seeing from the rest of the family. And then he delivered the first of two statements that would fracture the case wide open. He said, clearly and without hesitation, that he was there that night. Before we delve deeper into the forensic timeline and the chilling implications of his admission, I want to take a brief moment to ask for your support. If you appreciate meticulously researched, respectful true crime storytelling, please make sure to subscribe to True Crime Vic and leave a like on this video. Your engagement directly allows us to continue uncovering these complex cases and bringing them to our community. Thank you for being here. To understand the seismic impact of those words, we must first step away from the podium and look at the woman at the center of this storm. True crime narratives often suffer from a tragic flattening of the victim. The person who was lost becomes reduced to a photograph on a flyer, a set of demographics, a timeline of their final hours. But Nancy Guthrie was not a case file. She was a woman who had spent 84 years cultivating a life of deliberate purpose and quiet strength. Those who knew her emphasized that her age was merely a number, entirely disconnected from her vitality. She did not wait for her days to happen to her. She orchestrated them. Her mornings began before the sun fully crested the horizon, marked by a steadfast routine that anchored her household. She tended to her garden with the same patience she applied to her relationships. She attended her church not out of mere obligation, but as a cornerstone of her community presence. Most importantly, she was the emotional gravity of her family. Her daughter, Savannah, would later describe her as the glue, the steady force that drew everyone back to the center when life pulled them apart. Nancy was the woman who remembered the specific preferences of her grandchildren, who sent handwritten cards through the mail because she believed the physical weight of paper carried more love than a digital message. She expressed her devotion through preparation, always having a meal ready, always anticipating the needs of those who walked through her door. Yet, beneath this warmth was a spine of steel. Nancy was not a woman who left things to chance. She had worked diligently her entire life to build her estate, and she approached her legacy with the same meticulous care she applied to her garden. She had retained legal counsel. She had established clear, documented plans for her assets. She understood the mechanics of her own independence and guarded it fiercely. This is a crucial detail, because the tragedy of Nancy Guthrie is not just that she was vulnerable due to her age, but that her very competence, her insistence on maintaining control over her own affairs, may have been the catalyst for her disappearance. She was not a passive participant in her final weeks. She was actively managing her life, right up until the moment the timeline goes dark. The man who would eventually stand at that podium and admit his presence on the night she vanished had married into this carefully constructed family. Tommaso Cioni was the husband of one of Nancy's daughters, which granted him proximity, access, and a degree of inherent trust. Observers of the family dynamic noted that Tommaso was not a man given to explosive outbursts. He did not operate with loud, overt aggression. Instead, his need for control was quieter, more insidious. He preferred to be the individual in the room who possessed the most information. He liked to know the parameters of access, who held the keys, who understood the financial structures. For a time, this personality trait simply blended into the complex tapestry of family roles. But the equilibrium began to fracture when Nancy initiated conversations with her attorney regarding her estate. The exact nature of these legal modifications remains partially shielded by the ongoing investigation. But the trajectory was clear to those examining the records. Nancy was tightening the boundaries. She was asking pointed questions about financial oversight and systematically reducing Tommaso's access to her accounts. She was reclaiming authority that had perhaps drifted too far from her grasp. For a man whose sense of security was deeply tied to his knowledge and control of the family's resources, this systematic dismantling of his access was not just an inconvenience, it was a profound threat. The atmosphere in the household shifted. It was not a sudden explosion, but a gradual accumulation of pressure, the heavy static air that precedes a severe storm. Nancy, living alone and trusting the fundamental bonds of her family, likely did not perceive this shifting dynamic as a physical danger. She viewed it as responsible administration. She had no reason to believe that the administrative changes she was making would precipitate the events of February 1st, 2026. The evening of her disappearance began with the mundane camouflage of normalcy. A food delivery was made to the residence. The order was for 2 meals. This seemingly trivial detail is foundational to the investigation, as it physically places a second person in the home and establishes an expectation of shared time. Tommaso Cioni was already present when the food arrived, a fact he would later corroborate. To any neighbor glancing through a window, the scene would have registered as entirely unremarkable. A family member checking in, sharing a meal, providing companionship to an elderly relative. But inside the walls of that house, the undercurrent of tension regarding the estate changes was reaching a critical mass. Nancy had been preparing to finalize her legal adjustments. She had matters that required immediate attention, directives that needed to be codified before any further delays. At some point during this evening, she picked up her telephone and left a voicemail for her attorney. The specific contents of that message have not been fully disclosed to the public, but investigators recognized its profound significance. A woman in the process of restricting her son-in-law's financial access, leaving a message for her lawyer on the exact evening that son-in-law is dining in her home, is not a coincidence. It is a documented intersection of motive and opportunity. Then the narrative shifts from the realm of human observation to the cold objective testimony of medical technology. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker. For years, this small device had operated silently within her chest, a reliable guardian maintaining the electrical rhythm of her heart. Like most people with such implants, she had long since stopped thinking about its presence. It was simply a part of her biology. But a pacemaker is also a relentless data logger. It records timestamps, heart rates, and physiological anomalies with clinical precision. On the night of February 1st, this internal monitor became the most vital witness to her final moments, capturing a sequence of events that no human eye was meant to see. At exactly 8:42 in the evening, the pacemaker logged a sudden drastic alteration in Nancy's heart rhythm. This was not the gradual fluctuation of a body winding down for sleep. It was an acute spike, the physiological signature of a sudden surge in adrenaline, consistent with a person experiencing intense fear or sudden, severe pain. 5 minutes later, at 8:47, the device recorded sharp, erratic physical movement. The sensors detected the kind of kinetic disruption that occurs when a body is being physically manipulated, jostled, or restrained against its will. The data paints a picture of a struggle, brief but violent. By 8:52, the logs show an acute cardiac event. Nancy's heart was under catastrophic stress, failing to maintain its rhythm under the overwhelming physical and emotional trauma. And then, at 9:03, the transmission ceased entirely. 21 minutes from the first recorded spike of fear to the final cessation of the signal. Exactly 21 minutes elapsed. Investigators would later stare at this timeline, haunted by the implications of that window. What occurred in those 21 minutes was captured only in the electrical impulses of a failing heart. But the question that immediately followed was equally chilling. What happened in the hours after the signal stopped? When law enforcement eventually gained access to Nancy Guthrie's home, they were met with a scene that spoke volumes through its omissions. The front door was securely locked. There were no shattered windows, no splintered door frames, no signs of forced entry whatsoever. The physical integrity of the home's perimeter was completely intact. This immediately narrowed the scope of the investigation. Whoever had been in that house during Nancy's time of distress had not broken in. They had been invited, or they had possessed a key. They were someone the dog knew. Nancy's small dog, an animal naturally predisposed to alerting the household to strangers, had remained entirely calm throughout the evening. Neighbours reported no unusual barking, no sounds of a chaotic struggle bleeding through the walls. The animal's silence was a profound indicator of familiarity. The perpetrator was not an intruder. They were a known entity in that domestic space. As detectives moved methodically through the rooms, they began to notice the subtle manipulations of the environment. The garage door was not fully open, nor was it fully closed. It had been positioned at a very specific angle, one that effectively blocked the line of sight from the street into the garage interior. This was not a malfunction. It was a calculated adjustment of sightlines, designed to provide cover for whatever movements were about to take place. But the most damning evidence of premeditation was found in the home's security system. Nancy had invested in cameras to monitor her property, a standard precaution for an elderly woman living alone. However, when investigators attempted to pull the footage from the critical hours, they encountered deliberate gaps. The system had not suffered a power outage or a technical failure. The logs showed that someone had accessed the system remotely, using the correct administrative password. They had not guessed it. They knew it. From a device connected to the home's internal Wi-Fi network, the cameras had been placed into maintenance mode. This specific setting pauses recording without triggering the alarms that would normally alert the homeowner or the monitoring company. Crucially, the digital logs showed that this remote deactivation occurred before any physical tampering took place. One of the cameras had indeed been physically handled, but only after the recording function had already been neutralized. This sequence of operations is the hallmark of a planned event. A person acting in a sudden panic does not first log into a security app, navigate to the settings, input the correct password, and switch the system to maintenance mode before dealing with the physical reality of the situation. This was a methodical, step-by-step execution by someone who understood the technology, knew the network credentials, and had the presence of mind to blind the electronic eyes of the house before taking action. While investigators were slowly assembling this picture of calculated concealment, Tommaso Cioni was engaged in a different kind of concealment, the weaponization of silence. In the weeks following Nancy's disappearance, his behavior stood in stark, almost jarring contrast to the rest of the family. It is essential to acknowledge the legal reality that every citizen has the right to remain silent and the right to counsel. These are fundamental protections, and retaining an attorney is not, in itself, an admission of guilt. However, the optics and the reality of his absence created a vacuum that the public and the police found deeply unsettling. While Savannah and the other children were exhausting themselves in the public eye, organizing search parties, funding reward campaigns, and speaking through tears to the media, Tommaso was nowhere to be found. He did not stand beside his wife at the vigils. He did not hand out flyers. He did not post pleas for information on social media. He retreated entirely behind the wall of his legal representation. This stillness was interpreted by many as unnatural. When a loved one vanishes, the human instinct is kinetic. People search, they yell, they demand answers. Tommaso's complete lack of visible distress, his refusal to participate in the communal agony of the family, felt to observers like a man conserving his energy for a different kind of battle. He waited. He let the searches yield nothing. He let the tip lines run dry. He maintained his silence until the pressure became untenable, leading him back to that podium where he finally spoke. When he delivered his statement, The atmosphere in the room crystallized. He claimed he had been advised by his lawyers to stay quiet, citing fear and confusion. He stated that he had gone to the house, that a conversation about the legal changes had escalated into an argument, and that during this dispute, Nancy had fallen. He explicitly denied causing her harm, framing the event as a tragic accident followed by a panic response. But it was his final addition that derailed his own narrative and handed investigators a massive new avenue of inquiry. He stated, plainly, that she was not alone. By introducing an unnamed second party, Tommaso attempted to defuse his own culpability, but in doing so, he confirmed the presence of a conspiracy. He refused to name this individual, hiding behind ongoing cooperation with his legal team. But the implication was clear. The investigation instantly expanded. It was no longer just about a son-in-law who panicked. It was about a coordinated effort involving at least one other invisible actor. Once Tommaso placed himself at the scene, the circumstantial evidence suddenly gained immense gravitational pull. The pacemaker timestamps were no longer abstract data points. They were moments where Tommaso had admitted he was in the room. But the most devastating piece of evidence emerged from his own digital footprint. Shortly after 9 o'clock, minutes after the pacemaker signal had permanently ceased, a text message was sent from Tommaso's personal phone. The message consisted of a single word: handled. Investigators analyzing this communication noted the chilling sterility of the vocabulary. A man who has just witnessed an elderly relative suffer a fatal fall, a man who claims to be in a state of panicked confusion, does not text the word handled. That word implies the successful completion of an assigned task. It is the language of logistics, of problem-solving, of a job finished. It is entirely devoid of emotion. The recipient of this message was a prepaid, untraceable burner phone, purchased with cash, designed specifically to evade identification. Yet the cell tower data betrayed the attempt at anonymity. The burner phone had pinged a tower in close proximity to Nancy's neighborhood at the exact time the message was received. The second person Tommaso had alluded to was not a distant concept. They were physically nearby, waiting for the confirmation that the situation had been managed. Following the timestamp of that text message, the digital and physical trails aligned perfectly. The garage door sensors recorded movement after 9 o'clock, indicating something substantial was being loaded into a vehicle. A Bluetooth device, unregistered to the home and not belonging to Nancy, had paired with the security system earlier that evening, providing the mechanism for the remote camera deactivation. And then the cell towers tracked a steady, deliberate movement away from the residential neighborhood, heading outward toward the city limits, and eventually into the desert. The desert surrounding the city is an environment hostile to human life and exceptionally efficient at hiding secrets. It is a vast, flat expanse where the heat of the day gives way to a biting, isolating cold at night. There is no infrastructure out there, no witnesses, just miles of scrub brush and sand. When search teams followed the cell tower data into this barren landscape, they were looking for anomalies in a place defined by its emptiness. They moved in meticulous grid patterns, their eyes trained to spot the subtle disruptions in the natural order. First, they found the tire impressions. The sand had not yet been smoothed by the wind, preserving the distinct tread patterns of a vehicle that had ventured far off the established paths. Following the trajectory of those tracks, they discovered an area where the desert floor had been disturbed. The natural crust of the sand had been broken and hastily swept back over, a clumsy attempt to mask the excavation beneath. When the teams began to carefully remove the layers of sand, they uncovered a heavy, dark, moving blanket, the type used to protect furniture during transport, twisted and buried in the dirt. And beneath that blanket, they found the object that would cement the reality of the crime. It was the casing of a pacemaker, small, rectangular, coated in the fine dust of the desert, but unmistakably the device that had once kept Nancy Guthrie's heart beating. It was buried miles from her home, in a hole dug by someone who thought the desert would keep their secret. But a pacemaker does not remove itself. It does not travel across the city, and bury itself in the sand. Its presence in that desolate location was the ultimate, undeniable proof that the events of that night were not a tragic accident, but a calculated sequence of actions designed to erase Nancy Guthrie and the evidence of what had happened to her. The discovery of the casing in the desert shifted the entire paradigm of the case, proving that the silence Tommaso Cioni had maintained for weeks was not born of confusion, but of a desperate need to conceal a reality that the sand had finally given up. The unearthing of that small piece of medical technology in the vastness of the desert was a turning point. But it was far from the conclusion. The revelation of the second person, the chilling brevity of that single text message, and the meticulous dismantling of the home's security system all pointed to a conspiracy that ran deeper than one man's panic. The investigation was now racing to identify the owner of the burner phone, and to understand the full scope of the plan that had been set into motion on the night of February 1st. The desert had yielded its first secret, but the individuals responsible were still out there, their stories still evolving, their defenses still being constructed. To discover who the phantom second actor was, how the authorities finally pierced the veil of the prepaid phone, and what the ultimate legal reckoning looked like for those involved. You will not want to miss the next phase of this investigation. Please ensure you are subscribed to True Crime Vic and hit the like button so you are notified the moment Part 2 is released. The truth is rarely as simple as the first confession, and the story of Nancy Guthrie is only just beginning to reveal its darkest layers. The pacemaker casing buried in the desert sand was not simply disposed of in a moment of panic. Someone had extracted it from Nancy Guthrie's body, transported it miles from her home, and deliberately concealed it beneath the earth. This was not the action of a person overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. This was the methodical elimination of evidence by someone who understood exactly what that small device represented. A pacemaker is more than a medical implant. It is a data recorder that operates independently of human interference. It captures timestamps, cardiac rhythms, and physiological trauma with clinical precision. Whoever removed it from Nancy's chest and drove it into the wilderness knew that this device held an unalterable record of what her body had endured on the night of February 1st. They knew it could not be reasoned with, could not be intimidated by attorneys, and could not be silenced through carefully constructed public statements. So they buried it, choosing a location remote enough that they believed it would remain hidden indefinitely. The deliberate nature of that burial told investigators everything they needed to know about the level of calculation involved in the hours following Nancy's disappearance. While the desert search continued to expand outward from the location where the pacemaker had been recovered, investigators returned to Nancy's home with fresh perspective. They had already conducted a meticulous examination of the property, documenting the manipulated security cameras, the strategically positioned garage door, and the absence of forced entry. But now they carried new questions, and sometimes the answers to new questions have been sitting in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to ask the right thing. One of the investigators noticed a smart speaker on a shelf in Nancy's living room. These devices had become commonplace, particularly among elderly individuals who appreciated the convenience of voice-activated technology. You could ask for the weather, request a phone call, or control the lights without moving from your chair. The investigator knew that these speakers are designed to activate when they detect their programmed wake word, and when activated they capture brief audio clips that are stored remotely. The investigator submitted a formal request for any audio data associated with Nancy's device from the evening of February 1st. The files arrived, and the investigator sat down with headphones to listen. Most of the stored clips were mundane fragments of daily life, requests for weather updates, commands to call family members, the ambient sounds of a household operating normally. Then came the clip time-stamped for the critical window on February 1st. The investigator pressed play. The audio was brief, only a few seconds in duration, but its content was devastating. A voice, small and frightened, unmistakably belonging to an elderly woman, spoke a single word, please. Then came a heavy, blunt sound, the acoustic signature of a body impacting a hard surface. Then silence. The investigator removed the headphones and sat motionless for several minutes. In the midst of pacemaker data, cell tower records, security system logs, and buried forensic evidence, it had become easy to approach this case as an intellectual puzzle. A series of data, points to be connected. That one recorded word shattered the clinical distance. This was Nancy Guthrie, who had sent handwritten birthday cards and maintained her garden with patient care, speaking the only word she had time to speak before her life was stolen from her. If you value deeply researched, ethically presented true crime content that honors the victims while pursuing the truth, please take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Vic and leave a like on this video. These cases deserve to be told with accuracy and respect, and your support makes that possible. Thank you for standing with us. The audio recording became a critical component of the case file, but it also served a more profound purpose. It reminded everyone involved that Nancy Guthrie was not a collection of evidence. She was a human being who had experienced terror in her final moments and had reached out, in the only way available to her, for mercy that never came. Armed with the pacemaker data, the smart speaker recording, the buried device, and the text message sent from Tommaso's phone, investigators prepared for a formal interrogation. The detectives who sat across from Tommaso Cioni in the interrogation room were experienced professionals who understood the psychology of deception. They had learned to recognize the subtle tells that distinguish a person recounting genuine memories from someone constructing a narrative in real time. They began with open-ended questions, inviting Tommaso to walk them through the evening once more. He complied, his voice steady, his hands controlled. He had clearly rehearsed this version of events extensively. Then the detectives began placing evidence on the table. They did not theatricalize the presentation. They simply laid each item down methodically and allowed Tommaso to absorb the implications. First, the pacemaker data showing the precise timestamps. The sudden cardiac distress at 8:42. The physical struggle at 8:47. The acute cardiac event at 8:52. And the final cessation of signal at 9:03. Then the text message, a single word sent at 9:11, handled. Then the cell tower records, tracing a vehicle's path from Nancy's neighborhood into the desert. Then the photograph of the pacemaker casing in its sandy grave. Tommaso's carefully maintained composure began to fracture. The rehearsed narrative that had sustained him through weeks of legal maneuvering was disintegrating under the weight of objective evidence. His hands, which had remained still throughout the initial questioning, began to move restlessly. He requested a break. When he returned to the interrogation room, something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor. He leaned forward and stated, with notable emphasis, that he had not planned for Nancy to die. He repeated this assertion multiple times, as though the investigator's understanding of his intent was the most critical issue at hand. He described the argument escalating beyond his expectations. He claimed Nancy had been more resolute than he had anticipated, more determined to proceed with the legal modifications that would restrict his access to her estate. He said the confrontation had intensified, and that Nancy had fallen. He insisted it happened quickly. One moment she was standing, the next she was on the floor. Then came the admission that redefined the entire investigation. Tommaso stated that instead of calling for emergency medical assistance, he had contacted someone else. He referred to this individual carefully as an associate, someone he trusted when situations became complicated. The associate arrived at the house, assessed the circumstances, and made the decision not to summon help. According to Tommaso's account, it was the associate who began thinking about the situation not as a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention, but as a problem requiring careful management. The associate discussed what would happen if police were called, what questions would inevitably be asked, and what aspects of the evening Tommaso would be unable to explain satisfactorily. Then, Tommaso claimed, the associate made a chilling suggestion. The pacemaker needed to be removed. The data it contained needed to be eliminated. Without those timestamps, without that irrefutable physiological record, the story would become significantly more difficult for authorities to reconstruct, and so the pacemaker was extracted from Nancy Guthrie's body. Tommaso did not specify whether Nancy was still alive when this occurred, but the timeline suggests a horrifying possibility. At 9:03, the pacemaker signal ceased. At 9:11, 8 minutes later, Tommaso sent the text message, "Handled." That 8-minute window raises questions that are almost unbearable to contemplate. Tommaso stated that the moving blanket discovered in the desert had been taken from his garage. He claimed he removed himself to another part of the house, while the associate managed the subsequent actions, as though physical distance from the events somehow diminished his culpability. He described telling himself that if he did not witness what came next, it would be less real. A vehicle departed the property under cover of darkness, and somewhere in the vast desert, Nancy Guthrie was taken to a location that remains undiscovered. The interrogation provided investigators with substantially more information than they had possessed previously, but it also confirmed that the case extended beyond a single individual. The associate was still unidentified publicly, still at large, and still in possession of knowledge that could lead to Nancy's recovery. Finding the associate became the central focus of the investigation's next phase. Tommaso had provided fragments of information, enough to establish a starting point for investigative work. The prepaid phone that had received the handled text became the primary lead. Cell tower data tracked the phone's movements, and investigators began the painstaking process of mapping those locations against other known data points. A pattern emerged. The burner phone had pinged towers in Nancy's neighborhood on the evening of February 1st, then moved in conjunction with Tommaso's phone toward the desert, then diverged to continue further into unpopulated territory. A second Bluetooth device had been detected in the desert that night, distinct from the one used to access Nancy's security system. This device registered briefly before going dark in the area where the tire impressions had been found, confirming the presence of two individuals working in coordination. Security footage from a retail location near Nancy's neighborhood, captured 2 days before her disappearance, showed a man purchasing a prepaid phone with cash. The video quality was imperfect, but investigators were able to discern build, gait, and clothing details. One detective recognized the individual from previous records connected to Tommaso. Cross-referencing associates known to have contact with Tommaso against the physical description from the security footage produced a viable suspect. Further investigation revealed that this individual's personal cell phone, separate from the burner device, had also traveled toward the desert on the night of February 1st. Crucially, the cell tower data showed that after the initial stop where the pacemaker was buried, this individual's phone continued moving to a second location, deeper into the wilderness. Tommaso's phone had returned toward the city, but the associate's signal had kept going. This suggested a second site, a second purpose, and the possibility that the associate had not completed their work at the first desert location. Investigators would not confirm their specific theories about what occurred at this second site, but the direction of the investigation, the search warrants being filed, and the increasing focus on this unexplored area all pointed toward the belief that this location might hold the answer to the question that haunted Nancy's family. Where is she? A second suspect was formally identified. Law enforcement released a carefully worded statement indicating that they were actively pursuing another individual in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. This person had not yet been charged, but investigators expressed confidence that the evidence was leading them in the right direction and that the case was progressing toward resolution. While the legal machinery ground forward and search teams continued combing the desert, another tragedy was unfolding within Nancy's family. Tommaso Cioni was married to one of Nancy's daughters. In the initial weeks following the disappearance, this daughter had maintained a low profile. She had not appeared alongside Savannah at press conferences or participated in the public search efforts. Those who knew the family assumed she was processing the trauma privately, caught between the horror of her mother's disappearance and the impossible position of being married to the man at the center of the investigation. But after Tommaso's public statement, after he stood at the podium and admitted he had been present that night and introduced the existence of a second person, something irrevocable shifted. She withdrew from him, not through dramatic public declarations, but through quiet, decisive actions. The phone calls ceased. The visits ended. The private support that had existed before the press conference evaporated. His words had cost him the last person who had remained close to him. Savannah's public statements evolved as well. In the early phase of the search, she had spoken with the raw, unfiltered grief of a daughter desperate to find her mother. Her voice had cracked when she said the word "Mom." She had pleaded for Nancy's safe return, clinging to hope despite the growing darkness of the circumstances. After the press conference and the subsequent revelations, Savannah's tone changed. The desperation remained, but it had been joined by something harder and more focused. She stopped saying she hoped her mother would come home. She began saying she would not stop until she had the truth. Those are fundamentally different statements, and anyone listening carefully could hear the shift. The family was beginning to accept a reality they had tried desperately to deny, that the search for Nancy might not end with her walking back through her front door. That answers might have to substitute for the reunion they actually wanted. The glue that had held the family together was gone, and in her absence, the structure was failing. There exists a particular species of pain that lacks a proper name. It is distinct from grief. Grief, as unbearable as it is, has structure. Grief is what you feel when you know. When there is a funeral to attend, a grave to visit, a date to mark on the calendar, grief has edges and boundaries. It gives you something terrible to hold, but at least it is something you can hold. What Nancy Guthrie's family is experiencing is different. It is the agony of not knowing. It is waking each morning suspended in uncertainty. It is looking at the phone and wondering if today will bring the call that provides answers. It is driving past empty fields and desert roads and thinking involuntarily, the way the mind does without permission, could she be there? Did anyone search there? It is the pain of a question that remains unanswered. And as the story continues to unfold, Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. Let that reality settle for a moment. After all the forensic evidence, after the pacemaker data and the smart speaker recording and the buried device and the interrogation and the identification of a second suspect, after all the pieces that have been assembled into a damning portrait of what occurred on the night of February 1st, the most essential element remains missing: Nancy herself. Here is what the investigation has definitively established. Nancy Guthrie was alive in her home on the evening of February 1st, 2026. Her pacemaker confirmed her presence and documented her distress. The smart speaker captured her final word. Security system logs placed other individuals in the house with her. Tommaso was there. He has admitted it. He described an argument over estate changes. He described Nancy falling. He described contacting an associate instead of emergency services. He described remaining in another room while decisions were made about a living human being, as though she were merely a logistical problem requiring solution. The pacemaker was extracted and buried in the desert. A moving blanket, tire impressions, and cell tower data tracked a path out of the neighborhood into remote terrain. A second suspect has been identified and remains under active investigation. This individual is believed to have played a significant operational role in the events following Nancy's fall. The text message "handled" was sent at 9:11 in the evening, 8 minutes after the pacemaker signal ceased. All of this is documented. None of it tells Nancy's family where she is. The second location, revealed by the cell tower data, has become the focus of current search efforts. After the first desert stop where the pacemaker was buried, the associate's phone continued traveling to an area that has not yet been fully identified or searched. Investigators believe this second site may hold the answers that the first location did not provide. Search teams have been systematically working through the surrounding desert regions. It is slow, demanding work. The desert is incomprehensibly vast, and it does not surrender its secrets willingly. Every day that passes makes certain types of physical evidence more difficult to recover. Wind redistributes sand. The sun degrades organic material. Time operates against the searchers in ways that feel profoundly unjust. But the search continues. Every morning, teams return to the desert. They follow new leads when intelligence develops. They re-examine previously searched areas when new information suggests a second look is warranted. They persist because it is their duty, and because Nancy Guthrie deserves nothing less. The legal case against Tommaso Cioni is advancing through the judicial system. The evidence compiled against him is substantial and multifaceted. Prosecutors are constructing their case with meticulous care, ensuring that every element of what occurred is properly documented and legally sound. This process is not rapid. It lacks the dramatic courtroom revelations of fictional narratives. It is methodical and deliberate, requiring a patience that Nancy's family has been forced to develop against every instinct. The second suspect remains under surveillance. Warrants have been executed. Individuals connected to this person have been interviewed. Communications have been analyzed. The profile of who this individual is and what role they played on the night of February first becomes clearer with each investigative step forward. There are moments within this case that resist easy forgetting. 21 minutes, from 8:42 to 9:03, during which Nancy's body was recording its own trauma, while the people in her home were calculating how to manage consequences, rather than save a life. The word "please," captured by a device on a shelf, a single desperate plea that went unanswered. The image of someone digging in the desert darkness, methodically burying a small piece of technology because they understood it, contained truth that needed to remain hidden. The text message, that single word "handled," as though an 84-year-old grandmother with a garden and a church and children who loved her, was merely an item on a task list to be checked off and forgotten. These elements cannot be erased. Tommaso Cioni spoke at that podium, and his words became part of the public record. He sat in the interrogation room, and his carefully rehearsed story collapsed under the weight of evidence. The timestamps exist. The recordings exist. The buried pacemaker exists. But what cannot be undone, most fundamentally, is the choice made in the moments surrounding 9:03 on the evening of February 1st, when Nancy Guthrie needed help. The people around her chose concealment instead. That choice is the moral center of this entire tragedy. Arguments happen in families. Tensions over money, power, and control are as ancient as family structures themselves. Those conflicts alone do not create a story like this. What transforms family tension into criminal tragedy is what happens when something goes wrong. Whether you reach for the phone to call for help, or whether you reach for a different phone to call someone who will help you hide what happened, Tommaso Cioni reached for the wrong phone, and Nancy Guthrie remains missing because of that choice. Savannah has continued speaking publicly throughout the investigation. She has not faltered, not when it became clear that answers would take longer than hope could comfortably sustain, not when media attention migrated to other stories, not when well-meaning people suggested gently that she might need to prepare herself for devastating news. Savannah continues speaking because silence feels like surrender, and she is not prepared to surrender her mother to the desert and the people who put her there. In one of her recent public statements, Savannah said something that resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. She said her mother is not a missing person. She said her mother is a person who was taken. The distinction matters. One implies passivity, something that simply happened. The other acknowledges agency and choice, an action done deliberately by people who must be held accountable. Savannah needs the world to understand that difference, because her mother deserves more than to be reduced to a statistic. What happened to Nancy Guthrie was done to her by individuals who made calculated decisions, and those individuals need to answer for those decisions in open court. Savannah said her mother deserves to come home, not as a photograph on a memorial, not as a case file in a cabinet, not as a name mentioned in passing when people discuss this investigation. Her mother Nancy Guthrie, the woman who was the steady centre of her family, the woman who called just to hear your voice, who tended her garden with patient hands, who never missed a birthday, who had a cup of tea each morning, and a whole complete life that belonged entirely to her. Savannah said she is not going anywhere, and she meant every word. If you live in the areas surrounding the desert regions where this investigation has concentrated, law enforcement is requesting your assistance. If you observed anything on the night of February 1st, 2026, or in the immediately following days, anything that seemed unusual, even if you could not articulate why at the time, please come forward. Vehicle parked in an unfamiliar location. Lights in an area that is normally dark. Sounds that seemed inconsistent with the environment. If you possess any knowledge about the associate, about the prepaid phone, about the second location that cell tower data indicates exists, about any conversations you may have overheard that touched on these events, please contact investigators. Tips can be submitted anonymously. You do not need to provide your name. You do not need to appear in court. You simply need to pick up a phone or send a message and say, "I know something. I saw something. I heard something, and I believe you should know." Nancy Guthrie's family is not asking for anything unreasonable. They are asking for their mother back. They are asking for the truth to finish emerging into the light, because most of it is already there. What remains in darkness is the piece that matters most, the part that tells them where she is and allows them finally to bring her home. This story is not finished. It will not be finished when Tommaso Cioni faces trial. It will not be finished when the second suspect is formally charged. It will not be finished when the legal process reaches its conclusion and delivers whatever verdict it delivers. All of those milestones matter. All are necessary, but none of them constitute the true ending. The ending is Nancy coming home. Until that day arrives, Savannah will keep speaking. The search teams will keep walking the desert. The investigators will keep following the threads that the evidence provides. The cell tower data and the pacemaker timestamps and the single-word text message and the voice caught by the kitchen speaker will keep pointing toward truth. And somewhere in the desert, under a sky indifferent to human tragedy, the answer is waiting. We will continue to update this story as new information emerges. If Nancy Guthrie's story has affected you, if her case has stayed with you the way it has stayed with those who have investigated it and the family who lives it every day, then please do one crucial thing. Share this, put it in front of more eyes, more people sitting in their homes in cities and towns, near and far, who might know something they have not yet realized is significant. Nancy Guthrie sent birthday cards to the people she loved because she believed small gestures mattered, that reaching out mattered, that letting someone know you were thinking of them mattered. Reach out now for her. Subscribe to True Crime Vic so you are immediately notified when we have updates on Nancy's case and others like it. Leave a like on this video to help it reach people who might have information. Nancy Guthrie was not a headline. She was a grandmother, a mother, a person with a garden and a routine and people who loved her. She deserves to come home, and until she does, we will not stop telling her story.